Perfect. So hi, everyone. Firstly, welcome to today's webinar, Downtime to Upskill for UX Researchers. I'm Mary. I lead our specialist design and research recruitment team here at Robert Walters. So Robert Walters is an international recruitment company. We have offices in 62 cities around the globe, including 3 here in the US, New York, LA, and San Francisco. In the Bay Area, we partner with high growth tech startups, and we have specialist recruitment teams that help these companies hire PMs, engineers, marketing professionals, finance and ops, HR and talent, and of course, design and research. Today, we are joined by a panel of leaders from the UX research space who are going to share their insights and perspectives on hiring trends in this area, what you should have in your UX research portfolio, what you can all expect as researchers at a startup versus a big tech company, and how our new crazy remote reality has impacted the world of UX research. We will have a Q&A at the end, so please pop any questions you have into the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be asking as many of these as we can. So I'll quickly take care of introductions and then pass it over to my colleague Jocelyn, who's going to be leading today's discussion. So firstly, Rebecca, we'll pass it over to you.
Great. Hi. So I'm a UX research manager at Lyft. I've been there about 2 years. Before this, I was in Frog Design, so I came from the agency world. And at Lyft, I lead our growth research and our rider-facing research. So rider-facing research looks at the core business, how do we improve the rider experience? And then growth research looks at where could we go next? And really excited to be here. I love questions. I love alternative backgrounds and people coming into research from different directions. So really excited to talk to you about that.
And David, we'll pass it over to you.
Hi, I'm David. I am the manager of the user research team at Quora. I've been at Quora for, actually, it was 1 year last week, so it's been a year and a week, I guess. Before I was at Quora, I started the user research team at Nextdoor. And before that, I was going to combine 12 years at Facebook and Google as a user researcher. Also very excited to be here today.
Great, thanks, David. And Ronnie, great to see you.
Good to see you too. I apologize. My internet is a bit choppy. The pleasures of, well, do you let me know if I'm not coming in, okay?
Perfect. There's a bit of technical difficulty. We'll get through it, but thanks, Ronnie. And then Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jen. I lead our international research team here at Dropbox. Also the newly formed New Frontiers team, which is looking at future-facing trends in remote work, particularly around the sort of like business side, B2B, B2C. Prior to that, I was at Facebook and Instagram, and prior to that, I led a research team, a sort of small startup research incubator at UC Berkeley. And I'm glad to be here.
Awesome, thanks, Jen. And over to you, Joss.
Perfect. So I do have a couple of questions prepared for the speakers already. But like Mary mentioned earlier, if anyone in the audience has any additional questions, feel free to put it in the chat. And at the end, we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So I want to kick us off with the first question. So we've seen a lot of our clients ask for research portfolios the same way that they would for a designer, while others don't. Do you guys personally look at research portfolios when hiring for your teams? So I don't know if anyone wants to start first. I could just call people out.
Probably easier.
Yeah, Jennifer, do you want to start first?
Sure. We don't don't ask for research portfolios during the hiring process, but like many companies, we ask our research candidates to prepare a presentation of past work. And we usually ask them to, it's quite a robust presentation, so we usually ask them to kind of start with, you know, how the research started, how they chose the methodology that they chose, you know, what methodology it was, and really have them, it's about a 45-minute presentation, and we have them kind of go through it from end to end. And really what we're kind of looking for there is their kind of thought process, and, you know, how they sort of guided the team through this research. But yes, I've actually been in a situation where someone had asked me for a portfolio, and unfortunately, I'm, you know, probably like many researchers on the call, we're under pretty strict NDA restrictions about what we can share. I always find it a little uncomfortable when somebody asks me that. So I tend not to pass along. So yeah, but that's how we sort of do things here at Dropbox.
Gotcha. Yeah. And what about everyone else? Is it different for any of your teams, or do you guys also have a similar process to Jennifer?
I think pretty similar on my side. We don't ask for portfolios at Lyft for research. I definitely look at them if someone sends one along, but it's not part of our hiring process. Instead, which I often find more helpful, we ask people to often, you know, walk us through a hypothetical research question or a past project or both, and we use that as a way to better understand their experience and the way they think through a research question or project.
Gotcha. And David, at Quora, do you guys look at research portfolios when you're hiring for your team, or is it kind of the similar process?
It's a similar process to what's already been described. I think of a research portfolio as like a side dish. It makes a meal potentially better, but it's not going to make or break. Like if your interview or resume is not that great, you're like, no outstanding portfolio is going to save that. So I think it's you know, it does help, but it's not something that I would use as a major factor in either screening a candidate, deciding to bring them on site, or making a full hiring decision.
Makes sense. Yeah, and on that note too, so it sounds like the resume is what matters the most. So for all of you guys personally, what stands out to you on a UX research resume?
I can jump in here. In terms of what we look for in a resume and a quick review, I tend to take a look at where are they currently, and as well as the number of years of experience that they have, and any indication of the types of research projects or methods that they have expertise in. For me, it's really a matter of, hey, do I have the confidence that this person has demonstrated skills and impact in a way that I can make some logical leaps in terms of whether or not we want to bring them on site or screen them even further in the process. Just having that confidence, like, okay, this seems like the skill set or experience that we're looking for in hiring.
I guess I can jump in on this one too. The interesting thing, particularly if you are a hiring manager, like some of us and many, probably some of the other people on this call are, is that we don't actually see a resume, quote unquote, raw. Like, I don't actually manually screen every resume that comes in. There's a recruiter or somebody who typically screens them, and we've set up a candidate profile about who we're looking for, and then those get sent to me. And, you know, if it's a slam dunk resume, it's like very clear that they match the profile we're looking for, then okay, I'm looking for the things on the resume that matches the profile. If I'm looking for a quant researcher, I'm looking for past experience doing quant research, large scale surveying, experience in RNSPSS. If it's not, a recruiter will typically add some notes explaining why this person is a good fit, even if necessarily the resume doesn't reflect it. So, you know, what I look for on a resume sort of differs based off the position that I'm looking for, but I don't really ever look at it like without any additional information ahead of time. Even a referral that gets sent to me directly, I'll read the referral and then based off the referral, look at the resume to sort of see, okay, what, like, this person says this person's good. Let me look at the experience, the education, or whatever that speaks to why this person may be a good fit for our position. So in a lot of cases, I don't actually look at raw resumes as they come in. I sort of just, they get sent to me and then I review them and then make decisions based off them.
Yeah, I echo that with David. Like I very I don't get the raw resume, and it really varies wildly on like what position we're hiring for. So at the moment, for example, we're hiring for a director, and so that is a very different kind of candidate profile and resume, and has gone through like multiple screenings by the time, you know, it's gotten to me as one of the interviewers, whereas you know, a UX researcher or UX manager has gone through a different type of screening process. I would say for managers in particular, I tend to look at like years at previous companies, mostly because I kind of want to know, like, have they had enough like experience sort of seeing a project through from beginning to end, or like a goal that they've tried to see through at beginning and end. It's not a make or break for me, but I think as a manager, it takes longer sometimes to accomplish something that you're trying to achieve. And so I'm always a bit like wary if I've seen that somebody's been there for 9 months. Again, it's not a make or break for me, but it's always a question in the back of my mind. Same thing with UX research. Like I'm always curious. It's not a make or break as to if somebody has jumped around a lot, like, you know, what was it about the company that wasn't a good fit? But again, like David, it's very rare that I would see a sort of candidate profile without some other notes from the recruiter there.
And I'm seeing a couple. Oh, go ahead, Jocelyn.
Oh, no worries. Rebecca, did you have anything to share for that?
I was going to say one build based on the questions it looks like are coming in the chat about less traditional resumes or people coming from PhD programs or architecture, other backgrounds, for example.
Yeah, that's a perfect transition to our next question, actually, which is exactly what I was about to ask. Because as a recruiter, I've seen a lot of researchers with various backgrounds, whether it's more traditional academic backgrounds, or maybe they've transitioned into research from another role. So I wanted to get you guys' thoughts on, when you're hiring for your team, which do you prioritize, education or more of like industry experience? So Rebecca, it sounded like you had some thoughts on that. Love it if you wanted to start first.
I think this is definitely my process as opposed to Lyft's as a whole, but I tend to prioritize work experience or demonstrated potential, whether you did some scrappy side projects or found a way during a PhD program to do research with a startup on the side or something that was a little bit more industry connected. I definitely look for that, and I often place a little bit less emphasis on the exact job description requirements or years of experience with the title UX researcher, because I've hired some really amazing people that didn't have that title before they came to Lyft and have been outstanding and brought different perspectives. So that's something I definitely work with recruiters to emphasize when I'm drawing up what we want or what we're looking for.
Yeah, I agree. As somebody, I actually was in film production before I started my PhD program that got me into research. And so, like Rebecca, I'm always interested in people with more diverse backgrounds. And diversity can mean, you know, many things. We hired a researcher recently that had a military background, for example. And so kind of what I'm always looking for are problem solvers. Like, is there anything on this resume that demonstrates somebody has the ability to kind of get in deep and kind of get a problem in from beginning to end. That said, PhD programs, having a PhD, I also recognize is a long time commitment and can involve various different projects. So I like, if somebody's part of a PhD program, to see on their CV like what kind of projects they were working on during that program, what expertise they can bring to the table. Most companies that are of larger sizes will have actually specific university recruiting, and usually sometimes at a larger company you'll bring them in as an intern first. That's not always the case, but yeah, I think there's a variety, but I think a sort of diversity of backgrounds is always a benefit, and some way of demonstrating that sort of problem / scrappy solving ability is always a good sign.
I guess just a warning for people, a lot of my answers to these questions are going to be, well, it depends. If I'm hiring from an intern, obviously they may not have much experience at all, so therefore I have to rely on the education. And it's like, okay, what is the program they are in? Were there practical elements, internships or applied experiences or projects in that educational experience to help me get a sense of their potential or their applicability. If it is a senior level position, they may have not been in school for 10 plus years. So yeah, education is not terribly relevant at this particular time and place, because obviously, it's been many years since then. I will say this is a trend I've noticed on some new grad and some intern resumes, is that they'll take school projects and put them as work experience. I understand why they do that. It is very confusing from a screening process when people do that, unfortunately, because I've seen resumes where apparently somebody was a researcher at 5 different places at one time, and is like, oh no, it's because they're doing projects during that semester for several different classes. And so as a result, their education and their experience sort of gets mixed up together, which sort of makes it kind of hard at times for me to understand, like, oh, what is this person's actual experience? So I have seen that, and I have to say, from a screening process, it does make it a bit more difficult when people tend to do that.
Yeah, I do think it goes back to, as a has demonstrated some applied research skills. And I don't necessarily see as education or industry experience as one or the other.
Oh.
But instead, it's a bit of a school for 5 years within closely with different organizations for how to take those insights and turn them into action. So I think it's really for that candidate to do a great job of translating those insight context setting, so you have that confidence to bring them on board.
Yeah, and on that note too, I feel like we kind of talked about this, but just diving deeper in case there is any additional advice for those researchers who didn't come from a traditional academic background and are making that transition into UX research from other careers. How would you recommend they market themselves and be able to showcase themselves in that clear way that, Ronnie, you kind of mentioned earlier? But Jennifer, I did want you to, I think earlier you were mentioning how you transitioned from the film entertainment industry into research. I'd love to hear if you have any advice or how you made that switch.
Ooh, well, I mean, it's difficult because I made that switch by doing a PhD that sort of led to UX research. So what I have seen are people that have come from like a research operations background, or a design background or a consulting background, make that switch into UX research, and or have done like internships. I think are the kind of best way to get your foot in the door. And and or have like kind of started at smaller startups, and have sort of built out some research skills there. But I it's very, I have yet to see like someone being able to make like a hard switch. Like for me, film production to UX research was not like, oh, one day she's a producer and the next day she's a researcher. You know, there was that middle ground, right, of doing the PhD and then sort of leading a UX research team around a specific project. So but you know, again, like I think that having some transition period, whether you're a designer, that's maybe a more cleaner jump, and or internships, and or like working for a startup where you're able to kind of gain some skills on the job.
I can jump in here because I do know several people in this boat, and you know, there are certain fields that are closer to UX research, you know, like research operations. Lots of people who work in customer success or customer engagement. That's a natural shift over. Marketing, those things. But there's a lot of people who may not be any of those types of things. For example, I've met lawyers who want to become UX researchers, or people are cruise ship photographer. One thing I do recommend is that, look, your past experience is not useless. Leverage that because you are a subject matter expert in whatever previous field you were in. So if you're a lawyer, you want to become a UX researcher, well, that if you're in terms of marketing yourself, well, identify positions where your lawyerly background in law can be an asset to you in terms of being a UX researcher. For example, if you're a lawyer, perhaps you have more understanding of privacy, of policy, of that type of stuff. There's lots of UX research that is needed in companies in those fields. So I always say, it's like, you know, your vast background is nothing. If you want to make a transition, is not like you have to throw it away. You know, it can be an asset depending on what it is.
Yeah, I could give a specific example. So my background is actually in health communication, and my dissertation was on patient engagement and understanding how physicians and patients interact. And I'm not in the health field at all right now. At Thumbtack, we are connecting customers with local service professionals, hiring plumbers and DJs and wedding planners. It is not health at all. And the way that I found to market my PhD background, my expertise is in health comm, but I've marketed myself as more of an information seeking expert. And that is something I've been able to say that, hey, this is a skill that I can apply to many apps or technologies, right? It's like people are trying to find information. They're trying to connect with others online and offline, deeply understanding interactions and where are the gaps in those interactions. So it's finding creative ways to look at your expertise and then say, like, okay, let's take a step back. What am I really, and how can I apply that to other contexts that aren't necessarily the one that I originally pursued? So I would definitely encourage, especially the PhD candidates, any capstone projects. What are those additional areas positioned to look at problems in this way? And I can apply them strategically in these other areas.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Ronnie. I'd like to switch to the next question. So you guys all kind of mentioned a bit of your background throughout the different questions. As a panel, you've all worked at a mix of big tech or startup companies. I wanted to see if your ideal research hire changes based on what type of company you're at the moment. Oh yes, David, if you want to start.
Okay. So Um, okay, like you said, this depends. um, you know, at a large company, big tech, if you want, I think when people call big tech, I think they're referring to the Facebook, the Google, the Amazon, the Microsofts of the world and everything like that. What does your ideal hire look like it there? Well, I think at those places there's a bit more flexibility in the range of people that you can get. It's not like it's impossible to get a range of people at a startup. It's just when you have more people, and more capacity to hire, open to more people at different stages of their careers, different skill sets, different things like that. So, a company like a Facebook, a Google, or a Microsoft, they're going to have people straight out of school. They're going to have experienced hires. They're going to have managers. They're going to have, and they could be more flexible in terms of hiring more specialist people. For example, if somebody's a survey expert, well, it's like, okay, well, we're a huge company. We do surveys all the time. We're going to hire people with that specific expertise, right? So, I see, at least in my experience, that's a bit more likely of a possibility at a larger company. At a startup, well, I can only speak to my experience at a startup where I literally started the team, so it's just by myself. It's like your flexibility in that regard may not be as wide, because it's like, look, you have to get moving in a hurry, and you have to start showing impact in a hurry, right? And this is particularly tough in terms of, okay, do we want to bring on like new grads or junior people? I'd love to have new grads or junior people on my team. The issue is that we're a very small team. Do I have the resources to help develop you and help give you the support and guidance necessary to develop your career? That's harder for me and my small team at a startup. So therefore, I tend not to go after those people when we have open heads. So it's just, like, I guess, the circumstances and the scale often speak to like, okay, well, we need more of a generalist at a startup versus being more open to a specialist at one of those larger tech companies. So, I do think it does change. It's not to say these are hard and fast rules. The circumstances tend to lean one way or another.
Yeah. Does anyone else also feel like when it's at a larger company, you're able to hire or look for more specialized researchers, and at a smaller startup company or on a smaller team, you tend to look for candidates with more broad experience? Is that kind of the sense what I've been hearing from David as well?
Yeah, I think that's largely true. I think when you're at a bigger company, also you like a Google or a Facebook, you go through a hiring process, and then you have like multiple teams that you can choose from, or they want you. It's not like you're hiring for a specific job in a specific place, right? So I totally agree with David in that. It just you tend to have a sort of wider range of candidates that are needed in different areas. I'd also say that like this is maybe controversial to say, but I think there is a benefit in starting at a bigger company, and maybe going sort of downsizing or do what a lot of us maybe on this call have done, only because at a big company, you do have a lot of resources to learn a lot of things about your profession, right? So you have a lot more opportunities to attend training classes and learn from like other people. So I went from a Facebook to a Dropbox, which Dropbox is still a very big company, right? It's still 3,000 people, but our research team is much, much smaller. And so I was very glad that I had this experience working for a big company first, before I sort of went down to a slightly smaller company. I just felt better prepared in kind of like knowing what my superpower was as a researcher. That was different to what other people bring to the table. That's just my own personal experience. I think it would have been, just at least from my personality type, like it would have been more difficult for me to maybe start at a startup first. Just making that transition from academia to UX research. That's not to say that people shouldn't and can't learn on the job at startups. I think that's also very valuable. I'm just speaking from my own like personal experience.
Yeah. And Rebecca, for you, I think you went from more of an agency to Lyft. Was it the type of candidates you were looking for at those different companies a bit different, or have anything else to add?
Yeah, definitely different thinking about hiring for an agency than thinking about hiring in-house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, in agency land, is storytelling is number one, and being able to weave that story is sometimes takes precedence over being able to talk to impact. Whereas hiring in-house, whether it's startup or big tech, when I'm talking to people, what I want to think about is, what was the impact of that? What did that lead to? Tell me about that. And yes, I really care about storytelling and making sure that that person can really compellingly synthesize what they're learning and communicate that. But I also want to know that they can partner with people, whether it's a product manager or a data scientist or a designer, and get something done. And I think that's true for me. You know, at Lyft, I'd put Lyft somewhere in the middle of that spectrum of startup to big tech. Definitely on the scrappier side, despite the size. But that ability to partner and get something done is so critical. So that's something I really, really emphasize when I'm thinking about people coming into Lyft and being successful.
Yeah, and Jennifer, you kind of touched on this earlier of kind of the benefits of this, but wanted to hear all of your thoughts on what the benefits for researchers working at big tech versus startup companies, because we all know it's very different opportunities and types of roles. And I know, David, you also kind of switched from Facebook to joining as the first researcher at Nextdoor. So I'd love to know if you want to start that off and see if there's any advice you can give researchers that are joining a startup as a first researcher or a smaller team.
So I'm to echo what Jennifer says, you know, obviously one of the biggest things is resources. At a Facebook or Google, you know, budget is never an issue when you want to tackle a research question. You know, they have millions upon millions of dollars. You know, I've done research studies at Facebook that almost $250,000, no one batted an eye, right? So that's sort of nice as a researcher, is that you can sort of choose the method and the way to approach the question, and you don't have to worry about, do I have the money or do I have the resources to pay for it? Facebook and Google, if you're a researcher, will make that happen. They'll hire the vendors, they'll get you the facility, they'll get you the resources to do it. So that's definitely a benefit. That's sort of a nice thing to have that does not exist in the startup world. Let's just say I do not have anywhere near the budget I had at Quora and Nextdoor to do the research that I did at Facebook. I think the other one is, Jennifer and other people mentors, is that you're at a bigger company, you're large at the big tech, which I think is a proxy for like your Microsoft, Amazons, your Googles. You have other researchers there who are really, really bright and some of the best in the field. So you can learn from them and consult them. When you're sort of the first person at a startup, you are the expert by default. And like, there's no one, people look to you, you have no one else you could really like tap on the shoulder and ask about something when it comes to research stuff. So that's a nice thing to have, particularly at your larger tech companies. For example, when I needed help with a survey, one of the people I worked with before he worked at Facebook, he did the surveying for the Obama 2012 campaign. So that's kind of a nice resource to have to know that you're getting really good information. So, you know, that's definitely, those types of benefits are very, very, nice. What is the point of going to a startup then? Well, it's like, well, you know, there are a couple hundred researchers at Google or Facebook. You know, your purview of what you can work on and potentially the purview of your impacts is sort of going to be limited to the area that you're in, the team that you're on, right? You know, whereas if you join a startup, like you potentially could have a much larger purview in terms of the questions, the projects, the types of things that you take on, and the potential impact that you could have. You could affect the company-wide strategy, quite honestly, at a startup compared to, say, at a Google, which, you know, is a huge conglomerate. So, you know, I think those are some of the things that I would say are benefits of each.
Yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts on kind of what they feel like personally are the benefits for working at big tech versus startup? I know a lot of you guys have had both experiences as well.
I think there's a big difference with the unlimited resources to what David said. It's so nice to have lots of resources and more colleagues to reference and work with. But I will say, as working at a startup, that there's a lot more visibility that the research can have, just because there's less people doing that type of work, and it can immediately be impactful. You know, just as an example, Thumbtack, we're now working on a vision plan that the research and design teams are leading. And I think to do an effort like that at a Facebook or Google would take a lot more coordination and effort amongst several different teams, a buy-in across the board with many, many different PMs, analysts, engineers, VPs, all of that. But for us, we're able to kick off those types of conversations within a matter of hours, right? Not a matter of months or years. So I think there's a lot of benefit to being super small. Lean is probably the better word. Being lean and scrappy, that in such a way that you wouldn't be able to necessarily do it at a big tech company.
Yeah. Thanks for
I
sharing.
agree. I would say, like, it's hard. I mean, I don't know what David and Rebecca and Rannie think. Like, I couldn't imagine, for me, again, myself personally, being the first researcher at a startup. I totally agree. You get this sort of visibility, and you have that impact. I think it really depends on the startup, right? So for example, like, I don't know if I even right now in my stage in my career feel like I could be the first researcher and set that precedent at a company. I think that, you really have to kind of self-evaluate and be like, well, am I, what is my job going to be doing? What am I going to be doing here? Am I actually, is my purview supposed to be like building out the team? Or am I here to kind of like help the team engage and get a more customer first focused? I've seen people move into startups that way. And I think that can be super valuable. But I do echo, like, at a certain point when you're working for a big company, it becomes, and as that company grows, it becomes much, much harder to have a certain level of impact. And if that's important to you in your career, like working for a smaller company, you do have a lot more visibility across teams, and you do have that potential, to have your work be seen and be kind of adopted by, this CEOs and sort of like SVPs of that company.
Yeah, and kind of adding on to that too, when you are looking for your next opportunity or thinking about whether or not a startup company is a good fit, and what impact you would have, like, to make sure that research does have like a seat at the table, and the role is high impact at a startup company, what questions would you ask different stakeholders during the interview process to kind of get a sense if it is a fit or not?
I guess since I've done this more pretty recently, I guess I can do this. So there are questions I did ask and questions I would have asked in retrospect. So I think the very basic one is like, well, why now? You're a startup. Why do you need this role right now? What has happened that caused you to say that this is the role we need? And in my experience, you sort of want to avoid the two poles of that answer. One pole is like, we don't know, we're bringing you in to figure that out, right? And so it's like, well, if you don't really know why you want this person here, that's maybe a potential red flag. The other extreme is like, if they are very prescriptive, it's like, we want this researcher to do this. It's like, okay, well, if that's exactly what you want to do, then great. But if it's not, then you might not, the role might necessarily be what you want. So avoiding the two ends of that question, I think, are something that I would potentially look for. The other major questions I've asked is like, okay, well, this is my personal philosophy. We don't do user research just to use research. We do user research to produce insights and findings that we use to make better decisions that will lead to better experiences for people, right? How do decisions get made? That's what I'm very keen on understanding at the startup. How do you make decisions, and what is the role of user research, insight, data science, however, in those decisions, right? Because that sort of gives me a sense of where they're at and how might things actually be different should a user researcher, myself or whoever is there, right? So that's something that I am also very interested in. I would ask several questions about. And I think the other thing is like, okay, how invested is this company in making the user researcher successful? Obviously, you're going to, if you want to bring in user research, you want to bring someone who's really talented, who's going to do their best to contribute and work hard, right? That person can only be successful if other stakeholders and other cross-functional teams are also invested in user research success, right? Nobody wants to run into a situation where it's like, hey, we brought this user researcher in, they're going to need your help, and people are like, oh, big whoop, oh, like, I don't even know who this person is. You know, that's a situation you don't necessarily want to be in. So it's like, okay, well, who else is going to be able to help me? What is their familiarity with user research? How do they sort of envision them working in collaboration with this person? Would definitely be questions I would ask.
For anyone else, is there any other, Ronnie, I don't know if you have anything to add to what David also said.
Yeah, during these types of conversations, I think it's so important to just try to get a true sense of what exactly are you getting into, and almost treat it as a research interview where you ask these open-ended questions to really build that confidence again, right? It's questions like, how have you worked with research in the past? What do you identify as the most valuable use of that research? What can research bring to the table that you haven't seen yet? What are you hoping that a candidate who enters into this role is going to accomplish? What are your hopes and dreams? And then usually with that type of response, you could get a sense of like, oh, okay, they just really want me to be a research monkey and do a bunch of usability testing, and okay, not the place for me. Or are they looking for a strategic partner? And maybe that's something that gets you excited, and you want to go after that. And maybe that's a thread you keep pulling on, and asking more follow-up questions, and just asking who are the peers that the researcher will be working with. How do you envision them working together? What's an example project, right? I like to hear about examples because I really feel like I can anchor some practical information from it before making a decision.
Yeah, and Ronnie, I know you went from heading research at Thumbtack to now overseeing research design and creative. How did you personally spearhead and advocate for research at your company, or kind of had experience with that?
Oh my gosh, it's all about nudges. What I mean by that is like, it's not going to happen overnight, right? Like your research isn't just immediately going to make an impact, but instead there's a range of experience that people have with research, right? From your very novice, I've never worked with a research before. What do you do? How do you do your work? All the way to the expert where they're your best allies and advocates. They're like, yes, absolutely, love researchers. How do we get you more in the room? How do we get involved? Can I go and follow along on your studies? Those are the champions of the user experience. So for us at Thumbtack, I think we really just try to provide as much value as possible. And it's not just the traditional ways of having impact, right? As in, you conduct a study, you analyze your data, and then you present your insights. I think that's your traditional, typical way of having research impact. But trying to bring our expertise beyond that and saying, hey, yes, we're researchers, but we can also have we can bring our skills to internal aspects, such as really refining the scope of the questions or strategies. So I find with our team, they're really great at pushing for clarity and saying like, okay, wait, what are we going after? No, what are we really going after? What's the intent there? Who's our target customer? Everybody's our target customer. Is everybody really our target customer, right? These skills of really getting to the core of what exactly we want to go and pursue. I find that that skill set has translated into multiple contexts within the organization. And now our researchers are actively seen as, project managers, leading strategy. They're asked to be in the room, and we're getting more requests to conduct research, which is great. It's the best problem to have. But we're now we have a different problem, which is now we need more resources. Otherwise, we're just going to keep saying no. And now we're having to demonstrate a different skill set around prioritization. And we're good at that too. And I think many researchers just are skilled in determining not just what's urgent, but what's core and critical to the experience and what's important.
Jennifer and Rebecca, do you guys have anything to share on this as well?
Rebecca, I don't know if you do. I personally have not worked at a startup, so I don't feel qualified to answer this this question, but maybe Rebecca does.
I've worked at some very small startups, Series A, Series B before Lyft, or worked on things with friends on the side. So I've been in the very, very small startup culture, and I would basically just echo what's already been said by David and Rannie, that you want to really get a sense of what the culture and the people you'll be working with is like, especially a small startup, because that matters more than anything else, and how much runway or leeway you'll have to help shape your role and your impact. And if there's openness to that and you like the people, those are the two things that I would really prioritize at a small startup. And questions, as Ronnie said, that get at that, open-ended questions that'll help you figure out whether that's true.
Yeah, and the next question is kind of more geared towards smaller startups as well. So if there isn't like a research process on the team already, or maybe you've came in to create that, what do you feel like stakeholders typically look for in a researcher if they don't necessarily have experience with that?
All roads lead to impact. I think it doesn't always just have to be about impact, but this immediately. At the end of the day, what impact can you provide? How are you providing meaningful value to the organization? And I think as researchers, there's almost this, there's a bit of an identity crisis that we have. We're like, oh, are the things I'm bringing to the organization, can it just be done by anybody? I'm asking customers a bunch of questions. Can anybody do that? And there's debates about like the democratization of research and whether that's valuable. But I think for cross-functional partners, they really want to know, like, what value can you provide? How can you help me get there? How do we drive metrics? How do we drive results? And how can we continue to be like very strong partners? So yeah, I think stakeholders are really just digging into that.
So based off my experience, I echo a lot of the things that Rannie said. It's okay, the company obviously has goals, which if it's any startup, it's either more users, more engagement, more money, or all three. So to boil it down to essentials, right? So being able to identify, okay, how is your research going to lead to findings and insights that's going to help them reach those goals, I think is and being able to communicate that and crisply, convey that, I think is something that stakeholders are going to look for. It's like, okay, this person's just not some head in the clouds researcher that says, oh, the more we know about our users equals more money, right? So I think that's something. Also, I think what stakeholders are looking for, which is why I think a lot of startups try to grab people from companies that have worked from larger companies, is like, oh, this person actually have a plan to do it. Like, oh, this person's worked with like cross-functionally with data science and design and marketing, which already exists at our company, even though we don't have a researcher. Can they, based off that experience, be able to articulate how they would work with those people to produce research that has impact? So I think that's also what they're looking for. Is like, okay, well, that's all good, but you actually have a plan or some semblance of a plan about how you're going to do that. So I think that's another thing that stakeholders really want to get into the details about.
Yeah, that's a good point. And kind of changing it up a little bit, with the current climate of what's happening right now, I am getting asked by a lot of researchers how this pandemic is impacting research processes at companies. So I'm curious to hear, how has being fully remote impacted your teams and your processes personally?
Yeah, actually, I just led a big study on sort of being fully remote in general, like across multiple companies, because at Dropbox, we are, all about trying to like make people work in the cloud better. So this is like really important to us. I would say as somebody that does a lot of field work, we've had to shift everything completely to Zoom. And what that has meant, particularly for international research, is that, we've had a lot of like adjusting to time zones. So I just recently wrapped up a study where we were doing research in Japan, and that meant that our, interviews started at 5 p.m. and ended at like 10 p.m. Right. So having to make that switch in how we do field work has been one kind of major change that we've seen. I think the biggest struggle, at least that we have faced, and I think a lot of what we found in our research that companies are finding challenging, is how we conduct kind of larger brainstorm strategic meetings, right? There are some tools out there that exist today that sort of do the job. But when we're really trying to kind of dig in and really unpack a very difficult problem that we're trying to solve, Zoom is not necessarily, doesn't cut it for everyone. So I think that's been the biggest impact. I think it goes without saying that working parents, I don't know if anybody on this call is a working parent, have yeah, exactly, have had to take the brunt of this. At least at our company, we have really tried to put in place flexible hours for those working parents, because many of their children are not at school. But it has been, I'll be honest, like it's been really rough, because you still are expected to produce the same amount of work with a very like limited time, with less time. And so what we're trying to at least advocate at our company is like, how do we create different levels of expectation in this very strange time right now? And then I'd say thirdly, one of the biggest shifts we've seen, not only at Dropbox, but I think across all tech companies, but companies where you are able to remote, is more openness from management on being remote. I'm sure David and Rannie remember from Facebook, like we had a strict like 1 day a week working from home policy, and you had to be in the office the rest of the days. And I think that is going to drastically change. Like I think there's going to be a lot more flexibility in remote work, people that can live in different parts of the country, maybe going into the office 2 or 3 days a week. I think that is going to be one of the lasting impacts that we have. But again, I think the biggest kind of piece that we need to figure out is how we organize ourselves around kind of collaboration, brainstorming / offsites in a remote world. At least at our company, that's one of the things that is noted as the biggest challenge.
I'm just going to quickly second Jennifer's thoughts on this, especially the brainstorming, the design research methods that have definitely gotten in popularity, design sprinting, participatory design. So there's much harder to do remotely than in person. So if people can figure out how to do those remotely, I'll be definitely interested in understanding that. I would also say related to this is that I think us as researchers, like at Quora, we did most of our research remote anyway because most of our user base is not located in the Bay Area. I do think, especially during this time, that we have to really flex our empathy much more. I had a conversation with the researcher on my team, and I noticed he had set up his remote interview session sort of at 11 to 3 p.m. Pacific time. I'm like, well, why don't you add more spots? Like, it's like, well, why? Everybody's in home and they're going to be happy to participate, right? And it's like, well, no, they're not. Some people have to teach their kids. Some people out there are like us who are in Zoom meetings for hours upon day. They may not want to be in another Zoom meeting for your study right in the middle of their workday, right? So, that's why you should have maybe early morning slots or late night slots or lunchtime slots for people. And I know a lot of companies have different incentive guidelines for remote versus in-person. We don't. It's like we incentivize the same if you show up in person, whether you do remotely. And that's because, we understand this is a difficult time, and just because you can't leave your house and you're not supposed to leave your house doesn't mean that we should incentivize you less.
Yeah, Ronnie, or did you have anything to add on to this? Like, how's Thumbtack impacted by being fully remote with all the studies having to be on video calls and all of that?
Yeah, similar to what others have said, a lot of our studies were already remote and moderated, mostly because our user base is outside the Bay Area and you want to get that representation. Mm-hmm. However, there's a lot more context that we're missing, right? So for our local service professionals, as an example, typically we do a ride along, and we would go and see what's their setup like when it comes to their workflows, interacting with customers. Are they using their phone? Are they using their desktop? Are they using paper-based calendars? Is there a front office, a back office? How many employees do you have? How do you dispatch trucks? These are just all examples and context you're just missing when you're not in the field. So we're having to be a bit more creative about how we ask about those situations, and make sure that we get context where we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And changing it up to focus more on researchers who are interviewing for roles right now when everything is remote, do you have any tips for researchers who are remotely interviewing through like Zoom calls, video chats, virtual on-sites, and all of that? How they could best market themselves while having to do everything remotely?
I personally have loved, I have to say, like interviewing people remotely. I also think it's kind of been great for the interviewees. I don't know if anybody's been through a process of having an all-day insight interview. It is exhausting, and like I actually am. I don't know how, in retrospect, I don't know how I feel about that. Whereas interviewing people remotely has given a real, me anyway, like a real opportunity to kind of focus intently on the person that I'm talking to in a way that I wasn't necessarily, in retrospect, I didn't realize that I wasn't necessarily doing the on-site. And I think from the people that I've spoken that I have personally interviewed, it's been a huge refreshing change to not have like 5 hours of back-to-back interviews. So I don't know how others feel, but I actually think it's been great. And I think in terms of preparation, I would, you should prepare the same way that you would always prepare, like for any interview. I don't think the preparation process, in my opinion, has changed unless you're giving a presentation. Just like, be very prepared for, like almost over prepare for Zoom glitches or things that could happen. If you are presenting something, make sure that your technology is working, make sure that everything is like there's, you're doing your best to set yourself up for success.
I think the one tip that I would encourage during remote interviewing is to, you know, build in more opportunities for people to ask you questions, or to provide the chance for them to clarify, even when you're speaking one-on-one with somebody. What tends to happen when we do video chats or even phone calls is we tend to monologue a bit. And since over Zoom, it's kind of hard to read a room or read the person because they're, you know, on video. You may not pick up this person may want to talk to you, that maybe you're talking about something too quickly or too fast, and you may need to slow down or re-explain something. So I'll just be cognizant that communication is a bit different, obviously, so if you're not in person. So build in those opportunities and make sure that, you know, yeah, do you have any questions? Okay, you know, I just want to make sure that you understand what I've explained so far, because the next thing I'm going to talk about sort of is depending on making sure that, you know, what I talked about earlier is pretty clear. So just making sure you're cognizant of that.
Does Ronnie or Rebecca, do you have any tips for researchers that you'd like to share that hasn't been shared yet?
Yeah. So similar to remote interviews, right? You still need to create the space to build rapport. And I would encourage that as much as possible, especially at the beginning of the interview. And sometimes that manifests itself as like, hey, commenting about somebody's background, or I'll see a cat head pop up behind somebody's shoulder, and we have a really funny conversation about that. So I still think that it's a unique opportunity for candidates to showcase bits of their personality. You are participating in an interview at home. So what are the advantages that you can integrate there that really show the type of person you are and who you are as a researcher? Quick tip.
Well, we are out of time now. So unfortunately, we're not able to go through any more questions in the chat, but we'll follow up afterwards, see if there is any interesting questions we can answer for you all. But thank you all so much for joining. A lot of great points and advice was shared, and hopefully that was helpful for researchers that are tuned in right now. So just want to thank you all for joining our webinar today. Thank you, Ronnie, Rebecca, David, Jennifer, all of you guys for taking the time to really chat through these questions and give a lot of advice for researchers.
Thank you for organizing and having us.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good rest of the day.
Have a lovely day, everyone. Bye-bye.